Hey guys, this is our first episode of R&R, a weekly kind of stream pertaining to economic and fiscal issues with their social ramifications. And I'm here with Raj. So Raj, if you wouldn't mind, just give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what your background is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Robbie, for that introduction. As far as my background goes, I'm a graduate of the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, where I studied finance. After that, I took on a job working on Wall Street for a major financial firm. And having left that, I've now started a financial advisory firm. And I just look forward to using some things that I see. Hopefully, that'll be helpful. I'll learn that through your feedback in terms of macroeconomic environment, and as Robbie mentioned, some of their even social ramifications, and how that ultimately will tie back to some of the fiscal areas, to the economic areas as well. I look forward to just sharing some insights with you, and as well as learning from you as well. So I hope you'll use the comments positively, and I don't mean don't criticize me or anything like that. I just mean I hope we can create an active dialogue versus with each other rather than just a polarizing effect with some of the things that I say. So let's keep it active. Let's keep everything engaged, and I think we can all use this as a medium to learn and grow.
And as Raj said, just don't hesitate at all to post comments and questions that I can, pass along to Raj. As we'll kind of be conducting this as a question and answer format. So without further ado, let's just kind of dive right into it.
Sure.
So, Raj, Mark Faber and others have suggested that something changed in the American system such that everyone has started to kind of rip off the system. So, what is this something that's changed? And more importantly, who is responsible? And perhaps most importantly of all, how has this seemingly adverse change sustained itself?
Sure. I think Mark Faber definitely brings up an interesting point. It's definitely hard to pinpoint exactly when or where or how this happened, because I think it happened so quickly that a lot of times we look back over the past, especially 30, 40 years, and say, hey, how did things get to what it is now? How did things turn like this? So it's inherently a very tough question to answer. My hunch says that, okay, well, 1913, Federal Reserve Act was established. We created a private central bank in charge with the money supply of our nation, which has eroded 97% of the value of that dollar that's in your pocket. So that was obviously, a negative event or a tough event that we're now seeing the repercussions of. Then we can go to the 30s and 40s, where we had huge government basically implosion, where the government just completely grew way out of proportion. We can tie it back to then. The programs and a lot of the things that were established back then sounded great. They sounded like the surefire way to get us out of the Depression. And then now we can finally see some of those ill effects of a lot of those policies pursued by Roosevelt at that time. And then another point that definitely pops out in my head is 71, when we cut out completely a gold standard, went to a fully fiat currency, which took with it all level of responsibility and fiscal discipline. Hopefully I do think that some of that discipline will be restored in the future in the form of some kind of asset-backed currency, but maybe that'll be for a different discussion. So that's kind of how I see the timeline of what Mark Faber is sort of alluding to. Personally, going back to your question, when did this happen? A lot of those factors contributed to it, but I think we were relatively okay just up until the last maybe 30 years. We literally have become we literally went from the largest creditor nation to the largest debtor nation in this span. And we have to ask ourselves, what was happening in this span that allowed this to happen? Okay, and I think that's the point that we have to look at if we're going to try and answer this question, or at least touch this question. So going back, let's say 30 years ago, we were the largest creditor nation. We had relatively higher interest rates. Although we had a lot of inflation back then, we had relatively high interest rates. We had a central bank that supported relatively tight monetary policy. Volcker did a pretty good job while he was chairman of the Fed. And then we also had this sort of deregulation going on in the 80s. That, yeah, I agree. A lot of that deregulation may have caused a lot of problems. But, I'm a capitalist. I believe in free markets. And I don't think that you can solely blame regulation for any kind of misappropriation or misallocation of assets in the financial markets. I'm not a believer in that principle as well. I would argue that governments make things worse. They increase costs. Once again, hopefully we'll have another discussion about some of these topics later. Now, what went wrong? What was what has been going on for the past 30 years that never was really going on before that? And my answer to that question, the only answer that I can think of, is a lot of things or entity or people became too big, too influential, way too quickly. I know that sounds like the obvious answer, but when you have an outright collusion between banks, corporates, and Washington, when you have legislation literally being passed only to cater to them, where did that $700 billion show up on your bank account that they passed? That they said if we didn't pass, the world will collapse. The financial markets would cease to exist. Okay? So I think that Mark Faber also in that commentary brings up a very interesting point, is that when you have wealthy individuals and you have poor individuals, the question of votes comes to the forefront. Now let me explain. When you have the wealthy individuals, to them they think that they're the leaders, they're the drivers, they're the vanguards of our economy. They're the ones that keep things going, sustain things, create jobs. And on the other hand, you have poorer individuals, middle class, lower class individuals, who don't necessarily have whatever you want to call it, that will, that influence, that power, that inheritance, but demand transfer payments or entitlements. And their vote, let's go back to the point, their vote is still 1-to-1. So for the wealthy individual, he'll be thinking he's getting the shaft, because he only gets one vote, and the lower class individual gets one vote as well. So I think, now let's go back to that question, I don't mean to get off point here, I think that over the past 30 years, those wealthy people really started to understand this. And due to the financial engineering and some of the innovations in the financial markets, they've been really cleverly and very sort of skillfully, for lack of a better term, able to penetrate the United States government in ways that have never been penetrated before.
So what you're essentially saying, especially to the question of who is responsible, is that we can't really blame the average American individual or citizen in this grand scheme of things, because there are people who are higher up, who are elite, the vanguards, if you will, who are controlling all the pieces of this entire game, and in essence control the rules of this game.
Yeah.
So not only are you lost as a player in this game, but you simply don't even the rules. You don't even know the rules to which game you're playing.
We're so far detached from some of those rules in that game, that chessboard. We're playing a completely different game on a completely different chessboard on a completely different planet, it seems like. What they are doing is being carried out extremely cleverly, and they're doing a very, very good job keeping us away from the issues that really stand. November will come around, 2012. You'll have the choice between one or two likely candidates, and you got to pick one. But what they don't tell you, you're going to get more of the same no matter who you pick. And it's because our politicians have turned into nothing but prostitutes, and they've been successfully bought out by corporate interests to the point where the American people don't even have any form of say, any form of influence, any form of real rights anymore. It's completely mind-boggling. This went from the land of the people to the land of just a few people in just a few years. I mean, it's really remarkable what they've been able to truly accomplish.
We've been touching briefly and speaking more generally about trends in American history. You mentioned Bretton Woods as a specific example, and the times of Roosevelt as well. Can you please speak a little bit more on specific instances where something could have been done, but something else was done in its stead, which contributed to this what Mark Faber,
Mm-hmm.
Peter Schiff and Gerald Celente and other guys have been talking about as kind of the downfall of, the American system as a whole, American belief and ideology.
Well, whenever we somehow got into this dichotomy with governments and markets and governments and economics, and that somehow governments can come in and change the game of economics. And that's what economics is. It's a game. It's a science. It's a law. There's laws. There's laws of economics. There's literal, legitimate principles to economics that the government somehow thought that, hey, if we come in here, then all those laws, all those principles, everything will be rosy. We won't have to confine to any sort of constraints or discipline. We can do whatever we want. And we could spin it in such a way where it sounds like the greatest thing that's ever been done. That's exactly what we did with the $700 billion that was passed. And who knows where that money went? Did that, like I said in the beginning, that money didn't show up. That money's not in your bank account. It's not in your pocket anywhere. I mean, in fact, all the issues that plan, that stimulus, was meant to create or meant to help out in, the money went completely opposite, in the complete opposite direction. Look at the stock market, for instance. Over the past 3 years, over the past 2 years, actually, from March 2009, when the stock markets all bottomed out, S&P went to just a little over 650. The Dow just went a little over 7,500. Things completely tanked, and then they had a round of stimulus. That money, where did it go? Well, 4 years later, now we have the benefit of hindsight. We can see where that money went, and it went back into the stock market, back into driving up asset prices, back into driving up equities. Whereas we know that over the past 4 or 5 years, from unemployment numbers, basic numbers, we know that companies have cut costs, they've cut workforce, they cut capital expenditures, as well as their projected capital expenditures for many years to come. As the money funneled in to an area like that, where there's no real fundamental growth, no fundamental drivers to it, we have to ask ourselves, who's won? And when we know that 90% of the stocks in mutual funds are controlled by less than 10% of the population, and tiering that even further, just a small percentage that is institutionally held, meaning of that 10%, most of it's held by just a few institutions. So who really benefited? Those people who saw no change in their wealth, essentially. And now let's take on the people who don't have the leverage, who don't have the liquidity or the flexibility to invest in alternative forms of investment because they don't have the cash, they don't have the means. Now we can see what happened to them, the people that the program was supposed to help. Well, now we know that 13% of all U.S. homes are vacant. Many more homes are underwater. Something like 30 or 40% of all mortgages are underwater, meaning the mortgage value itself is in excess of the market value of the house. As you know, unemployment has tanked. Real unemployment is something like close to 25%. I mean, this is depression-type numbers we're looking at. So bottom line is, I just want to wrap things up here. The bottom line is, you don't want to believe in the numbers the government tells you. Inflation is out there. You are not being helped. That should be very, very clear. You are not being helped by this printing of trillions and trillions of dollars. You are not being helped through any of these fiscal programs and spending bills. Keep that in mind.
All right, great, guys. We look forward to your comments and feedback. And as you can tell, we're trying to tell a story of America from an economic angle and a social angle. And next week's topic will be inflation. As we talked about the American system this week, next week will be inflation. So we look forward to it. All right, thanks.
Take care, everyone.